All right, so this video is probably going to be a doozy. I was previewing the slides before I hit record, and I mentioned in the last video that we might be able to wrap up Schopenhauer with one more lecture, but I don't think it's going to be possible. I think all he says about music, I'm probably going to put on this one video. So this one will be entirely devoted to his comments on music and the will, how it relates to music. And then the next video will probably be shorter than most of them, and we'll just be kind of wrapping things up with Schopenhauer. It'll be a conclusion video. So let's just dive right into this quote that I have, and he begins, I mentioned this already before, and you might have just gathered it from some of his comments earlier on in the reading, that he holds music higher than any of the other art forms. To him, when it comes to the hierarchy of, and this makes him unique, I want to say, from every philosopher that we've studied so far. Plato doesn't like any of the arts, but I suppose if he were ranking them, the least atrocious for him, probably, I don't know, I'd have to think about it. My memory serves me incorrectly, but I want to say it would probably be written poetry, maybe, epic poetry, narrative poetry. Because at least it's not imitating, it's just narrating. It's more direct, maybe a direct song or a dithyramb, I'm not sure. But yeah, for Plato, that would probably be like the least atrocious. The philosophy of Aristotle, in his ranking of the arts, he doesn't seem to be very clear about it, but from what we gather, he seems to hold tragedy pretty high up there. Obviously, when we get to Kant, he thinks poetry is the highest and music is one of the lowest. And so we get a reversal of the Kantian hierarchy here in Schopenhauer. So what does he have to say about music? What is so great about it, right? This is one thing I dig about Schopenhauer. And in fact, I was a music major for about a year. And I was also doing a little bit of independent study on my own time in philosophy, because I took a philosophy course as a part of a core curriculum and really got interest just drawn in, and the rest is history. But there's quite a few. Well, there's more than there would be in other majors. People who are familiar with the work of Schopenhauer. You find a lot of these in music departments, and I suspect it's because of his admiration and love and a lot of the great complimentary things he says about music. So let's start off with this quote here and see what he says. Music stands alone, quite cut off from all the other arts. In it, we do not recognize the copy or repetition of any idea or existence in the world. Yet it is such a great and exceedingly noble art that its effect on the inmost nature of man is so powerful, and it is so entirely and deeply understood by him in his inmost consciousness as a perfectly universal language, the distinctions of which surpasses even that of the perceptible world itself. Right? It's otherworldly. It transports us, right? It's a universal language, much like people talk about mathematics being a universal language. That's a very Pythagorean way of seeing things. But also, this is interesting too. This is something unique. The other arts, remember from previous videos, you should know, other arts are a representation or a presentation of a Platonic idea. Not so in music. It's not a copy or repetition of any idea. And it's not something that's existent in the phenomenal world. Further, its representative relation to the world must be very deep, absolutely true, and strikingly accurate, because it is instantly understood by everyone. Right? When we hear a song, even if it's instrumental, he's primarily talking about instrumental music here. Think about, classical music. He's writing in the 1800s. But when you hear a piece of Beethoven that's in a minor key, and it has this tragic sound, we know it's tragic. It's like, oh, I think he's writing it that way to make me feel sad. No, you're all, oh, that's a depressing song. Maybe you should change it. I want something more uplifting, right? It's instant. And it has the appearance of a certain infallibility because its form may be reduced to perfectly definite rules expressed in numbers, right? You can express math in mathematical notation, from which it cannot free itself without entirely ceasing to be music. Some people might push back on that. I used to be a part of the Houston noise scene. It's a thing. Look it up, right? But I was considered a noise artist. I still do dabble in that from time to time. But I would always get this from my musician friends. That's not music. But yeah, it's noise. Whatever. I don't care, right? Is it art? Schopenhauer might not say so. At least it doesn't produce this, perhaps. I would argue against him, though. Maybe noise music and other forms of 888, what you would call, if you're a music major or a music nerd, you call atonal, right? He's mainly talking about Western tonal music. All of this can be reduced to definite rules. So, he's saying that music is this universal language, right? Just the way mathematics is, and it can be reduced to mathematics, okay? It's very deep and accurate at the same time. It's intimately understood, and it has at least the appearance of a certain infallibility. It's marked by definite rules of proportion. Yet the point of comparison between music and the world, the respect in which it stands to the world in relation of a copy or repetition, is very obscure. So whereas each individual work of art is a copy or a representation of a certain idea, the painting of de Delacroix, when he paints the picture of the lion, it's a representation of the idea, the Platonic idea of a lion. But music, he says, is a representation or a relation of world itself, the entire world, not the individual Platonic idea. But he admits that the comparison is very obscure. Men have practiced music in all ages without being able to account for this. Content to understand it directly, they renounce all claim to an abstract conception of this direct understanding itself. So while we can definitely reduce musical pieces to mathematical formulae and into musical notation, what explains this power and this effect that it has on us? It's just direct, it's known, and it's enough. We don't need to explain that. It's understood by all people, through all cultures, through all times. Music is this universal language. So do we see the idea in music? I've already sort of, hinted at where he's going with this. The Platonic ideas are adequate objectification of the will. To excite or suggest the knowledge of these by means of the representation of particular things is the end of all the other arts. Okay, we talked about this in previous videos, right? Because the works of art themselves are always representations of particular things. The painting of the lion is a painting of a particular lion. The sculpture of the human is a representation or a copy of a particular human. And the end of that is to present the Platonic idea. And this can only be attained by a corresponding change in the knowing subject, right? That's the will-less subject we talked about in one of the earlier videos, right? That, this detached subject, not attached to needs, desires, wants, or conceptual expectations. Thus, all the arts objectify the will indirectly, only by means of the ideas. And since our world is nothing but the manifestation of the ideas in multiplicity, right? All these things that we see, the flowers that grow, the cats and dogs that run around and reproduce, human beings as well, they're all manifestations in multiplicity of the Platonic idea, right? Trying to come to this ideal. Though their entrance into, though that's the wrong there, it's misspelled up there. Though their entrance into, that's the wrong there, Thier, their entrance into the principium individuationis, the form of knowledge possible for the individual as such. Music also, since it passes over the ideas, is entirely independent of the phenomenal world, ignores it altogether, could to a certain extent exist if there was no world at all, which cannot be said of the other arts, okay? I really want to push back on him on this, but first let's back up and unpack a little bit of what he said here, okay? So the other arts objectify the will indirectly by means of the ideas. We talked about that more in depth in other videos, right? The painting brings forth the idea in a strict, in a vivid, distinct way that affects the observer and gets them this understanding. Our world is a manifestation of these ideas in their multiplicity. Through their entrance, that should be through there, and that should be there as the possessive, through their entrance into this principle of individuation, right? Each of us understands ourselves as an individual thing through this principle, right? Through the principle of individuation, through our ability to distinguish ourselves from our surroundings, and also to individualize the things around us, right? That this thing is different from this other thing. Remember, from previous videos, we discussed how during this pure aesthetic experience, when we have a will-less subject, that principle breaks down and we no longer see ourselves as an individual, but become merged with this oneness of the will of the universe, which is really the true nature of reality for Schopenhauer, okay? But in other arts, it's different the way this is affected. It's affected through the idea. Music also, he says, passes over the ideas. Music also, since it passes over the ideas, is entirely independent of the phenomenal world. So it doesn't need to use a particular Platonic idea. It actually can pass over the ideas. It's entirely independent of the phenomenal world. It ignores it altogether. Could to a certain extent exist if there was no world at all, which cannot be said of the other arts. I want to push back on this because I'm like, what is he saying? He's saying that music doesn't require a representation of it. Certainly he does. Don't we access music through perception, through, namely our ears, through hearing? And so that's a phenomenal experience. Sound is a phenomenal experience. So I think that it's not entirely independent of the phenomenal world. He's trying to say that because there's this direct effect on us, that we don't have to recognize sadness in a song for the song to make us feel sad. We don't have to recognize happiness in the piece of music to feel the happiness. It's just a direct thing. It's not through the conduit of an idea. Okay, I get that, but it's still a perception. It's still something I hear. So I don't quite think he's got what he wants to. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. And he's saying something different than I think he is. But if he wants to say that music is not a part of, it's independent of the phenomenal world. At least he says to a certain extent, right? He doesn't say completely. To a certain extent can exist without it. I don't know to what extent, but it's not the idea that we encounter in music. We encounter the will directly, okay? It's not through the idea. Music is as direct an objectification and copy of the whole will as the world itself, nay, even as the ideas, whose multiplied manifestation constitutes the world of individual things. The world is a manifestation of all these ideas. Music is thus by no means like the other arts, the copy of the ideas, but the copy of the will itself, whose objectivity the ideas are. This is why the effect of music is so much more powerful and penetrating than that of the other arts. For they speak only of shadows, but it speaks of the thing itself, the will, right? Not the representation, but the will itself, the direct will, not the world as the will is represented to us. So music is the will objectified. Since, however, it is the same will which objectifies itself both in the ideas and in music, though in quite different ways, there must be not indeed a direct likeness, but yet a parallel, an analogy between music and the ideas whose manifestation in multiplicity and incompleteness is the visible world. In other words, when we look at the visible world and we see all the plants and animals and humans and everything that exists in it as a manifestation, as different manifestations of the will at different various grades, higher and lower grades of its capacity, I guess, for lack of a better word. Since that is the world is all these ideas manifesting themselves in objective things. And if music is a representation of the whole world together, then there has to be some sort of parallel between the elements that we find in music and all of the ideas. So he's going to get into this, and I'm skipping a whole lot of material because he says so much about music. We're going to focus mainly on what he says about melody. So he says that the melody that we find in music corresponds to a certain thing in the world, right? He thinks the human individual consciousness. But then we'll talk also a little bit about harmony and different compositional techniques, like a change from one key to the other, and also the return to the keynote. Some of this stuff might not be familiar, the terminology, if you're not familiar with any music theory at all. So when we get there, I'll try to elaborate a little bit to make it a bit more clear. But again, the point he's making in this quote is that there has to be at least a somewhat, if he's right, and he thinks he is, that music itself is a mirror of the world itself. It's the will objectified, in the phenomenal. Then there has to be some parallel, right, between the elements of the world and the elements in music, right? The elements of the will objectified and the elements that we see play out in musical compositions. Okay, so he starts, like I said, with melody. And that's he spends probably more time on melody than he does on anything else, and so that's the one I picked to focus on. If you want to go back to the reading, and if you're a really big music fan, and maybe you want to write your paper, if you're one of my students, you're going to write your paper on Schopenhauer. I recommend you go back to the reading and look at this in more detail. But like we said, we're going to focus mainly on melody for the remainder of this video, and then we'll pick up with a few other comments that he makes about other elements of musical composition. So in the melody, in the high singing principal voice leading the whole and progressing with unrestrained freedom, in the unbroken significant connection of one thought from beginning to end representing a whole, I recognize the highest grade of the objectification of the will, the intellectual life and effort of man. As he alone, because endowed with reason, constantly looks before and after on the path of his actual life and its innumerable possibilities, and so achieves a course of life which is intellectual and therefore connected as a whole. Corresponding to this, I say, the melody has significant intentional connection from beginning to end. It records, therefore, the history of the intellectually enlightened will. This will expresses itself in the actual world as a series of its deeds. You might say this somewhat relates to what he said earlier about the human grace and human beauty, right? That one of the things about representing humans is that we're our beauty, the fact that we're an objectification of the will, to use his terminology, has to be represented temporally, right, through time, not just spatially, right? Because unlike plants or animals, he even says, they don't really have a history the way we have a history. Our life is a series of events that have a kind of episodic quality to them. But there's a connection that connects all these episodes, and there's ups and there's downs and all this. Same thing with the melody of a song, right? This is probably the most independent, like the conductor today. This is the most independent and fluctuating element of the musical composition. It has a history, I guess you could say, analogously. Okay. But melody says more. It records the most secret history of this intellectually enlightened will, pictures every excitement, every effort, every moment of it, all that which reason collects under the wide and negative concept of feeling. Right? When we talk about a feeling, he calls it a negative concept because there's not really much positive content. When I say I'm sad, it's really just a word. If you've never been sad yourself, if you've never been happy yourself, if you've never had an emotion, you're not going to know what it means. the word sad is just the word at that point. It's just a direct feeling or emotion that you have. So at that point, it's just a negative concept, and it can't be apprehended further through its abstract concepts. Therefore, it always has been said that music is the language of feeling and passion. You can speak it, or you can speak sadness through a sad song. You can speak through a sad composition. You can speak passion and fire through a composition. So as music is the language of feeling and passion, as words are the language of reason. Kind of reminds me what he says about allegory in the previous video, right? Allegories, it's silly. You can just say it in a book. Why would you put it in a painting? Just focus on, for him, representing the ideal in the painting, this perfect ideal, Platonic idea. Now, the nature of man consists in this. This is the kind of, I guess, more of Schopenhauer's Buddhism, if you might call it that, right? The Buddhist influence is shining through in this quote, right? He talks about the relationship between melody and human suffering and satisfaction, right? This sort of cycle of satisfaction and suffering and disappointments and completion and wish fulfillment and the desire for new things. We're a leaking jar, to use Plato's metaphor. We're filled up and then we leak and we need more sustenance, right? We need more things that we strive and desire for, right? How does this apply? How is this analogous to the melody in music? Now, the nature of man consists in this, that his will strives, is satisfied and strives anew, and so on forever. Indeed, his happiness and well-being consists simply in the quick transition from wish to satisfaction, and from satisfaction to a new wish. For the absence of satisfaction is suffering, the empty longing for a new wish, languor, ennui. And corresponding to this, the nature of melody is a constant digression and deviation from the key note in 1,000 ways. So for those of you that aren't familiar with some of this terminology, I'm assuming you understand melody. We went over it, my students and I went over melody. We talked a little bit about it earlier in the semester when we were discussing Plato. So I'm not going to talk about it here. But what is he talking about when he talks about the keynote? In Western musical composition, right, you might talk about, you write a certain piece of music in a particular key, right? Like let's say C major. That's the simple one. That's the most basic. That's sort of usually the scale that you start with if you're first learning how to play music and you're learning theory. The keynote would be C, the C chord. Okay, so that's what you start with. That's the first chord, the C chord. Usually, in Western composition, the melody is based on that. That's sort of where it begins, on the C, and then it starts to fluctuate, right? It digresses in many ways. Typically, you go to the 4 chord. So in this case, if we're in C, you go from C to F, or to G, you go to the 5 chord, and then back to 4, and then eventually you'll return to the keynote, right, to C, okay? I think I've already explained that enough, at least enough to get the analogy here, because he's gonna use it again. That's why I feel it's necessary to explain this terminology somewhat, right? So the suffering that we feel as human beings, this constant satisfaction and then longing and then satisfaction and then longing and then even the sort of languor or ennui, the sort of apathy, all of these can be somehow represented directly through music in the melody. Okay, it corresponds to a constant digression and deviation from that keynote from which the melody typically begins. In all these deviations, melody expresses the multifarious efforts of will, but always its satisfaction also by the final return to an harmonious interval, right? You go from a 5 to a 1, or from a 4 to a 1 chord, right? From a G chord to a C chord. And so still more to the keynote, to the beginning, to the C, the original from where it began. The composition of melody, the disclosure in it of all the deepest secrets of human willing and feeling, is the work of genius. We talked, I think, enough about genius already. whose action, which is more apparent here than anywhere else, right? The musical genius is, for him, since music is the greatest art, musical genius must be the greatest genius. It lies far from all reflection. The work of genius lies far from all reflection and conscious intention, and may be called an inspiration. Here's another area where, and we've already talked about this before, but here's another area where he deviates quite largely from Kant. Kant sees the artist and artistic production as very deliberative, as very meticulous, deliberative, slow, gradual, whereas for Schopenhauer, if it's going to be a pure, direct manifestation of the will, or objectification of the will, it should be done without reflection or conscious intention, right? It's more of an object of direct inspiration. As quick transitions from wish to satisfaction and from satisfaction to new wish is happiness and well-being. So quick melodies without great deviations are cheerful, right? Like Peter and the Wolf. That's really cheerful. Slow melodies strike painful discords, right? Dun, 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 dun. Only winding back through many bars to the keynote. These are as analogous to the delayed, hardly won satisfaction. Sad. The delay of the new excitement of the will, languor, can have no other expression than the sustained keynote. Dun, 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 right? The effect of which would soon be unbearable, very monotonous, and unmeaning melodies approach this effect, right? The melodies just go everywhere. They are also the same as monotonous ones. They have a similar effect, right? Okay, so we talked about how melody, again, his overall point is that there are these parallels in music between phenomena in the world. Since music is a reflection of the entire will, and will is objectified in the world, then there must be a parallel. So melody is a parallel to the human consciousness, the human will, in all of its gradations and variations, and its suffering and fulfillment. Now, what's the parallel between music and death? Okay, it's a change of key. Okay, so when you're hearing a band play in one key and then they sort of change the key to another, that's hard to emulate by humming, so I'm not going to try to do that. But a change of key, is like death. And here again we get more of his Buddhism, more of his Hinduism. I think more Hindu than Buddhism. He seemed to know a little bit more about the Upanishads and the Hindu Vedantic tradition than he did for the Buddhist, but he drew from both, okay? So how does death fit into music? How is music a reflection of this phenomenon of death? Okay, so the transition from one key to an entirely different one, since it altogether breaks the connection with what went before, is like death, for the individual ends in it, but the will which appeared in this individual lives after him as before him, appearing in other individuals, whose consciousness, however, has no connection with his. So Schopenhauer believes this, he seems to believe, to some extent, the Buddhist, Hindu, Jainist also believe this conception of samsara, the cycle of birth and death, reincarnation, the idea that, when we die, we are reborn in something else. To what extent and in what sense he believes this, I don't want to dwell on too much. It's not that important for our purposes. But for him, he thinks that this phenomenon, which he believes in, this sort of cycle of death and then rebirth and other things, is signified in music by the change from one key to an entirely different key in a composition. So again, the music is the entire will itself objectified, not a particular aspect of the will, a particular Platonic idea that's a manifestation of the will, but the entire will itself objectified in a perception, right? Perceptual, at least in this case, something that can be heard, a phenomenon of sound. But it must never be forgotten in the investigation of all these analogies that I pointed out, music has no direct, but merely an indirect relation to them. For it never expresses the phenomenon, but only the inner nature, the in itself of all phenomena, the will itself. It does not therefore express this or that particular and definite joy, this or that sorrow, or pain, or horror, or delight, or merriment, or peace of mind. But joy, sorrow, pain, delight, merriment, peace of mind themselves. To a certain extent, in the abstract, their essential nature, without accessories, and therefore without their motives. Yet we completely understand them in this extracted quintessence. So when we hear sorrowful, painful pieces of music, we are hearing sorrow, pain itself. We're directly feeling it. We're having a direct experience of pain and sorrow, right? We're not hearing the sorrow of the person who wrote it, right? They might have written it from that place of sorrow, from that will that felt sorrowful. But when we hear it, it's not that experience that they had that we're hearing. We're experiencing it directly as well. We're experiencing the in itself without accessories. Hence it arises that our imagination is so easily excited by music and now seeks to give form to that invisible yet actively moved spirit world which speaks to us directly, and clothe it with flesh and blood. In other words, to embody it in an analogous example. This is the origin of the song with words, and finally the opera, the text which should therefore never forsake the subordinate position in order to make itself the chief thing, and music a mere means of expressing it, which is a great misconception and a piece of utter perversity. For music always expresses only the quintessence of life and its events, never these themselves. It doesn't talk about particular events, particular experiences, but all beauty, all art, all sorrow, all guilt, all exhilarating feelings, everything, all aspects of will direct. And therefore these differences do not always affect it. It's precisely this universality which belongs exclusively to it, exclusively to music, together with the greatest determinateness. It's immediately felt. It's very determinate. That gives music the high worth which it has as the panacea for all our woes. It's the one art form that is the most effective at producing that state that Schopenhauer so highly prizes, that will-less state, that will-less subject, right? Thus, if music is too closely united to words, it tries to form itself according to the events. It is striving to speak a language which is not its own. So, when it comes to the relationship between music and language, Schopenhauer is warning us that we need to be careful here. We have this direct sort of emotional intuition, this directly felt intuition of what it is that music is expressing, right? We see the will directly in music. And it can't really be put into words. But yet it's so powerful, we want to do this. We want to put it into words. And so for him, he says that's the origin of song. That's where music with song. So originally all music he thinks was instrumental. And it served this sort of direct primal function, a direct representation of the will. But it was so powerful that we tried, to our chagrin, to put words to it, and that's where song came from. Finally, opera. But unlike Plato, remember back to Plato, he says that when we look at the elements of music, the lyrics or words, the melody, the rhythm, for him, all the other elements are subordinate to the words. The words are the key. The words, the lyrics, that is what is important, and all other music should serve it. Schopenhauer is making the exact opposite argument here. Because music is this direct representation or objectification of the will, you don't want to cover it up with music. That's like putting a filter in front of it, and you don't want to do that, right? The music should be the focus, and the words should maybe be accessories to it, not the other way around. This is quite different again than what Plato claims in the Republic. So he'll say more about melody, but we also bring in this notion of harmony, right? How do all the elements in a composition harmonize with one another? And back to this notion of a reflection of our world. If music's a reflection of our world, and melody is a reflection of the will, the human will, then what is harmony reflecting? Okay? So the highest grade of the objectification of the will, man, could not appear alone and isolated, but presuppose the grades below him, as these again presuppose the grades lower still. We talked about this more already in previous video. Again, a lot of it is indebted to Plato, you could say, and this is an illustration from some medieval, or actually Renaissance era illustration of sort of the great chain of being, right? You have all these lower life forms, the minerals, the vegetables, the animals, leading up to man, and then God, obviously, if you know the Christian theologian version, God is at the top here, right? But all these higher grades, he presupposed the grades lower still, right? They make the higher grades possible. All the lower grades are subordinate to the higher grades, and the human will is the highest grade of will that we are familiar with, that we have knowledge of. In the same way, music, which directly objectifies the will, just as the world does, is complete only in full harmony. So all the elements in a musical composition are like all the different grades in this great chain of being. In order to achieve its full effect, the high leading voice of the melody requires the accompaniment of all the other voices, even the lowest bass, which is to be regarded as the origin of all. So the bass is sort of the low, the mineral, right? This is sort of the dirt, right? The bass. Sorry, bass players, but you're at the lowest grade in the musical spectrum here, right? The melody itself enters as an integral part into the harmony, as the harmony enters into it. And only thus, in the full harmonious whole, music expresses what it aims at expressing, right? So again, if music is supposed to be this objectification of the will, and the will is objectified as the world itself, then there has to be somewhat of parallel. And harmony is all these elements together, the bass being the minerals, the earth, and the melody being human consciousness, right? All harmonizing together. Okay, this next point on music, right? There are other elements in music that correspond to phenomena in the world. And one of them is conflict and strife. This is something I don't think we explored. I don't think we might not even have mentioned it at all so far in our exploration of Schopenhauer. But one thing he says about the will that underlies all phenomenon is that there's a certain conflict in it, just like there's conflict in us. Right? Sometimes we're conflicted. We have one drive that pulls us in one direction and another drive that pulls us in another direction, right? We might see that apple pie on our neighbor's windowsill and no one's looking and the pie smells really good and we haven't had our breakfast yet, our stomach's all grumbly, and there's a certain part of us, even if we're the most innocent of people, that we want to go eat that pie, but then we're like, no, that's my neighbor's. I gotta respect my neighbor. They're a good person, or whatever moral justification you have for not doing it. So just like we are conflicted, just like our will is conflicted as individuals, as we experience ourselves as an individual, the world will, the entire will that we're a part of, is also conflicted. And this is also something that we find in music. Notwithstanding the self-adaptation of all the phenomena of the will to each other as regard their species, which constitutes their teleological aspect, there yet remains an unceasing conflict between those phenomena as individuals. So in other words, when we look at an entire species, of animal, right, like rabbits or cats or dogs, there's a certain coherence and a certain uniformity of purpose, okay? When we look at them as individuals, there's going to be conflict, right? If we look at the whole universe, there's a certain coherence and balance. But if we look at individuals, then we see that there's constant strife, there's constant tension, right? Even we were talking in an earlier lecture about the tree as the result of all these threads and tendrils and things that are sort of stuck in, all the threads and the fibers that make up that plant. There's a sort of tension that is apparent through all of its manifestations, right? This is true of all manifestations of the will. And it's visible in every grade. It makes the world a constant battlefield of all those manifestations of one and the same will, whose inner contradiction with itself becomes visible through it. In music also, there is something corresponding to all this. Maybe we talk about conflict resolution or a counterpoint in music. These are both examples, I think, good examples of conflict in music. Now, I think I should shut up here. This video's gone a lot longer than I even planned it to, and we're done with Schopenhauer's exploration of music. We're going to now turn to the very end of Schopenhauer. We're going to talk about art in general and its relation to truth and the will, and talk a bit about Schopenhauer's pessimism, which hasn't, I think, really come out yet in any of these lectures I've given. So many people refer to Schopenhauer as a philosophical pessimist. So he has this very dark, pessimistic view of the world. You may have gathered this from some of the things I said already about his notion of the world soul, the will. He's not the first philosopher to have a conception of the world as a mind or a will or as this active force, as the cosmos, the universe itself, as an active being. But he's one of the first, or maybe is the first in the West, to have a rather negative, or one might say pessimistic view of this will. Most philosophers think of this will as rational. It may seem pretty terrible when we look at the cosmos. I mean, we see some of the natural disasters and things like the coronavirus that happened and seem pretty terrible. But the idea that the philosopher has is that we step back and see the whole picture, we'll see that actually everything is orderly and rational and is as it should be. But for Schopenhauer, he's saying, no, when we pull back, there's tension, there's conflict, there's strife, there's a constant resolution, and then new tension and desire. The world will is just like us. It is not rational always, right? It vacillates between hunger and satiation. So again, I better stop there. That's enough, but I was just kind of previewing the next video. The grand finale for Schopenhauer is coming up, so I hope to see you on the other side. I'm going to take a quick break, and then I will be right back.